Hey folks, welcome to the Thursday edition of the Whitfield Report. I am your host, Sam Whitfield, recording here in the studio. Welcome to the show. So, as you guys have probably figured out by now, the Thursday audio edition, it's kind of my Bill Burr rant style / kind of bullshit about whatever I want to type format show. That's the way a friend of mine put it. So I'm just gonna shoot the shit as usual with you guys. Kind of have a one-way conversation, but I like to imagine that you guys kind of get where I'm coming from. Those of you who are certainly regular listeners know me and know my views on things well enough to know where I'm at. And if this is your first time listening, welcome to the Savage Express, Sam's Savages and all that jazz. But anywho, by the time you hear this, it might be Friday, so even if this is TWR Thursday, you might be hearing this on Friday, and the reason being is because I actually had a meeting with my college counselor today for last minute class changes right before, or I should say during the time that I usually record the Thursday podcast. So that's why this episode may be going out on Friday for some of you guys. But anyway, folks, yes, it is the end of summer for me pretty much. I'm going back to, school next week. Not that will change a whole lot, in terms of the podcast for you guys. In fact, in some ways it will actually be better because all of my guests that are usually, on vacation during the summer and traveling, they'll be available now. It's funny, you would think that people would be more available to do these things during the summer, but as it turns out, that is not the case. So, one thing I do want to talk with you guys, I do want to get somewhat serious this episode. And, I have some kind of light and fun news also to talk about towards the later half of the episode, but I do kind of want to rant here for a bit because to be honest, folks, I've had a lot on my mind lately, not just regarding this podcast and things like that, but I did an episode a few weeks ago after the shooting in Texas and the shooting in Dayton, Ohio. And I said, two very specific things, not to really give this guy any more attention than he needed to initially, and then also I said not to politicize this and give the politicians and the media what they wanted. And I realized that I'm just one podcaster with a relatively small audience. I mean, I've definitely got a big audience than some other podcasts out there, and I'm not even saying that as to try and brag, but I've got a decent sized audience. But at the same time, I recognize that I'm just one influencer in a sea of now tens of thousands of podcasters and media personalities. So I implored people to really try and, stay away from pointing fingers and making this whole thing political. And of course, what happens? People immediately jump on Facebook. They immediately jump on Twitter, and then, and everyone did their, condolences for the victims, but almost immediately began the whole gun control versus non-gun control debate. And, that it always saddens me that we live in a society now, I guess, where we can't even take a full 24 hours. We literally can't make it through 24 hours anymore after any type of tragedy without someone or one side politicizing an event. And most often, not always, but most often I've noticed that it's the left that does this. Not that the right is particularly any better at this. They kind of have fallen into the same trap in recent years as well. But it just really kind of saddens me that we do this as a society, especially when I don't think, it's necessarily called for. I think that we need to take, ideally, America, whenever these things happen, we should all take a week to kind of reflect and process this, and then the following week talk later. And I was actually on a podcast with a guy earlier this week. I'll promo that at the end of the show. So just kind of keep that in the back of your head. But long story short, I've been talking to a couple of people, and the one question, I guess, that I've gotten from a lot of people who listen to the podcast and who watch the YouTube channel, and people in my real life too, everyone's kind of talking, why is the country so divided now? We can't seem to, every time something happens, it immediately goes into tribalism, divides. Now, some people will blame that on Obama, the right does. The left will blame that on, Trump and Trumpism. You can't go anywhere without hearing about what a piece of crap Trump is from the left. The right did that a lot with Obama. But here's, in my mind, I finally kind of figured out what has changed. And I think it's a change that wasn't necessarily intended to be bad. And I don't think it is a bad change in and of itself. But I think the advent of social media, 10 years ago, or roughly a decade ago, changed things more or less. I think back to 2008 when I was in 8th grade. I was in junior high school going into high school. And, I started the podcast. I started like my very first podcast, the Whitfield Nation, like a year earlier. And, for the first 2 years of my podcasting career, I was really just kind of dicking around with it and like trying to find my, radio voice. As most of the listeners know, I really wanted to be in talk radio and that, whole political spirit. I wanted to be like a young Rush Limbaugh, essentially. And, I started the podcasting medium, which I think is great, and I'm going to get into that here in a bit too. But social media really took off like a year later, like Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff when I was in high school. And like as far as like trying to promote stuff, like my podcast and my blog and whatnot, it was great. And, I love social media because it's allowed me to build a base. It's allowed me to connect with other people who kind of share a passion, for podcasting and for citizen journalism and for politics and et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of good aspects to social media. So I'm not, crapping on it just because of technology or whatever. But I do think that one of the unintended kind of consequences is that a lot of people forgot that we're in a conversation with people, and people found kind of solace in hiding behind a screen, and the other person might, you can go under like a username, like a fake name and a fake alias, and the other person might be under a fake name or a fake alias, or even if they're not, even if they're under their real name, like on Facebook and whatever, they're far away, so you can kind of say whatever. And I think people essentially got comfortable hiding behind screens, and everything just became vitriolic. And then you have the algorithms, which are pointing, people towards one side or towards the other. I don't really know if the social media companies intended for this to happen. I've read theories that like Facebook and Twitter and whatnot, that all this division and all kinds of the ways that we're communicating, it's the new, social engineering by the tech companies. And I think that certainly could be true, like in the case of Mark Zuckerberg. But honestly, like I think Jack Dorsey, and I think a lot of other tech CEOs kind of felt this way too. I don't think they really knew like what their platforms were going to turn into. I don't think Jack Dorsey really understood the political dumpster fire, or like just the internet dumpster fire in general that Twitter was going to become. And I've talked to people who have met him before. I don't want to say who those people are, out of respect for confidentiality, but there are people who have talked to Jack Dorsey and whatnot, and they all say the same thing, that he generally seems like a nice guy. He generally kind of seems like, in his own way, kind of flabbergasted and sometimes stunned that Twitter took off the way it did. Now, I'm not saying that he's completely free of some of the flagrant abuses on Twitter and whatnot. I'm not changing anything from what I said about Facebook and the social media companies needing, to either be regulated by conservatives or, by pro-free speech people, or, preferably just kind of broken up and so that they don't have monopolies. But, long story short, I think the division and kind of the breakdown in communication essentially is what, has caused all this division. It's not Trump, and it's not Obama, and it's not anyone in particular. I think our way of communicating as a society has changed, and we've kind of taken the human element away from that. Now, podcasting is sort of an exception, because podcasts and live streams, like the ones that I do, and like the ones that Joe Rogan does, are very conversational, right? And this brings me to my other point too, something else that has been bothering me. So, Joe Rogan, one of the highest rated podcasts in the world, number one consistently on the Apple Podcast charts, on the Spotify podcast charts. Arguably he's one of the greatest top 10 podcasters of all time. And he could be number one of all time, and I would say I'm a fan of his. Now, the reason why I'm a fan of his is not necessarily because I agree with everything that Joe says. I don't. But the thing I like about Joe Rogan in his podcast isn't necessarily even Joe, but it's more or less Joe's style of podcasting, and the fact that he doesn't interview people so much as he has conversations with people. And he'll have conversations with people on both the left and the right. He'll have conversations with people from all different backgrounds and all different walks of life. And from what I've noticed, it doesn't really seem like he's pushing a narrative. To me, he's just a guy who honestly has a conversation with people. And I bring Rogan up because for the past year and a half now, I've noticed this trend where he'll have Ben Shapiro on, or let's even say Gavin McInnes on as a better example, or Milo, right? He'll have some of these more right-leaning figures on, and the left will call him an alt-righter and label him as alt-right, Right Vox or one of those publications just this year did a piece calling Joe Rogan alt-right, so he's not safe. Well, then Rogan will interview some Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard, and he'll be called a leftist and a bleeding heart and just like a dumb pot-smoking leftist, from those on the right. So he can't win. And I'm not crying over Joe. I'm not saying like, oh, poor Joe. Any of that. He's a big guy. I, understand that he doesn't really need me defending him. And I'm not necessarily, defending, like I said, I don't necessarily agree with all of his views on things. But people seem to misunderstand his, what his podcast is. It's not it's not like a traditional interview show. It's just like a conversation. That's it. He converses with people, and he converses with people from both sides. And I feel that that's really important today in America, right? We have the left and we have the right. We have the libertarians and the conservatarians, which, I'm conservatarian. We have all these different spectrums, right? And we have all these polarizing figures, intentionally polarizing figures, on the left, like Antifa and, like Cenk Uygur and like Sean King and all these other, lefties. And then we have Richard Spencer on the right and, Owen Benjamin on the far right. And a lot of these like intentionally polarizing, like alt-right figures. And we have the polarizing figures as well who are, less so. And then we have people who want to have like just like honest conversations, right? Like me and like several other indie podcasters out there. And, I am pretty open with my views as a conservative, libertarian, more right-ish guy, but I'm friendly with people who are, more like purely libertarian or, pretty conservative. I'm friends even with like some, with some, people who are pretty far left. I wouldn't say communist, like that far radical, but they're still like reasonable on the left, I guess. And, those are the types of people that I try and have a conversation with. And I think that those are important conversations to have. I think the only way to really fix America isn't really to, necessarily to vote for someone. I think that definitely helps. But to have a conversation and to have an open dialogue with rational people, right? I think sometimes it's even good if and people from within the party can kind of debate, policy or debate philosophy within like a ideology. Like, I really do kind of find it disappointing that a lot of conservatives are throwing Dan Crenshaw just to the wind outright, right? I understand that people are upset with his comments on red flag laws. I'm not a big fan of them myself, but as a conservative, like, Dan Crenshaw to me is still a million times better than a lot of the lefties that he was running against, who are politically ambitious and hell-bent on, promoting leftism. And, some on the right want to throw Crenshaw out, because he said something about red flag laws. Well, I don't think he necessarily wants to, institute him to them as much as the left does. I don't agree with him on that. I don't think that he's as radical as the left wants, and I'm not necessarily even saying that we should do, what he is suggesting. I'm just saying that for goodness sake, we shouldn't throw our allies out, as conservatives just because they stray from the pack on one thing. And I wouldn't even say Crenshaw is straying. I think he's just putting his own opinion out there, and I think it's okay to disagree, with our party officials and our elected officials. But, for some conservatives to be tweeting out that Crenshaw is a cuck and, fuck Dan Crenshaw, that's stuff that 3 weeks ago, if a liberal had tweeted that same conservative who is now, saying those epithets towards Crenshaw, they'd be getting on the person from the left and from Antifa for being, a lefty or a libtard or something. And that is another whole thing in of itself. Granted, there are certainly wacko leftists out there, and granted, there are wacko right-wingers out there who intentionally want to inflame things, but for goodness sakes, you don't need to own your liberal friend at lunch. You don't need to defeat those who are close around you. Same with the liberals who have conservative friends and family members. Instead, have a conversation with them, and you might not be able to change their opinions, but they might be more open to hearing your opinion. And, in my case, I was able to actually sway a friend who was kind of a default liberal over to being a conservative. Why? Or to being a conservatarian. Why? Because I didn't insult him. I didn't try and yell at him. I just had a reasonable conversation. And then he was doing some research, and he was like, holy crap, the Liberty Way really is better. Right? So, and that's my main purpose here. My main purpose, don't get me wrong, I'm not softening. I'm still Savage Sam. I'm still going to be promoting, conservative values and, liberty-based ideas. None of that is changing. I still call it bullshit when I see it, pretty consistently from the left and from the alt-right. That's the other thing. Both extremes are bad, and both extremes need to be called out, which is what I try and do, and I do get pretty hardcore and animated, like Alex Jones, about it, but I don't go off on, just your average person, because there's no reason to. There really isn't. And so, I tend to think that we have, honest conversations with people, and even, honest conversations with those that we disagree with in political media that can be reasoned with, if there were like a more reasonable person who was, on the left, who wasn't completely, social justice warrior, someone rational like my friend Jeff Hamill. I've had him on the podcast. We don't agree, on very much policy-wise, but we both agree that the far left is bad, and we both agree that, like, the alt-right is bad, and we both agree in, like, rational conversation, right? We have different approaches to things, but at the end of the day, we're buds. And, I guess, like, that's my takeaway, is this division isn't one person's fault. It's, it's not like one party's fault. It's just a breakdown in communication because of technology. Podcasting certainly is helping with that on, like, the public scale. But in your own life, ladies and gentlemen, start a dialogue. That's the best thing you can really do, is start, like, a dialogue with the people around you, with those who agree with you, with those who disagree with you, and try and get them to do the same. That's the best thing we can do, is, just have conversations. Inform your, friends and family about why you're a conservative or why you're a libertarian, or, and just have those conversations. So, that is that. And that's really, in terms of the serious news, what I wanted to cover. And I think that will actually do it for the Thursday edition of the podcast. I will have a bonus episode actually out on Friday as well, before the Saturday live stream. So be sure and check that out at some point. But anyway, folks, I want to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening, and I really appreciate you guys. And that thing I mentioned at the beginning of the program. So I actually had an opportunity to be interviewed on Monday by Robbie Robertson, who hosts the Out of the Blank podcast. And he and I actually sat down, he interviewed me, and he just wanted to know about me and what I was about. He didn't necessarily, like, we covered politics a little bit, but he just mainly wanted to chat with me about, like, my beliefs and who I am as a person. And that's the other, thing. He's kind of what inspired today's episode, is just having conversations. And that is so critical. That's something that, I've done whenever I can on the podcast. I'm going to do a lot more in the remainder of the year, and hopefully next year as well. And, I don't want to give too much away, but it was a really good interview. He'll be posting that, on his feed. So just go over there. I want to give a shout out to Out of the Blank podcast. And, of course, I'll post my episode on the blog and whatnot once it's out. And Robbie and I are actually planning on doing a podcast on here as well. And he's an interesting individual. And he and I got along great. And I think you guys will like him and his conversation style. And, if you guys are listening to this and you actually heard my interview, from Robbie's podcast, and you're over here listening now, welcome to the Savage Express. And I want to thank you so very much for listening to the podcast. And for those of you who are regulars, just thank you so very much for listening. Have a great day. God bless. God save this great nation. Godfrey and MXC in that order, and I'll see you on Saturday for the regular show, and then I'll see you guys tomorrow for the bonus episode. God bless and God save the Sky Nation. I'll see you on the next episode of the Whitfield Report. Hey there, folks. If you've made it this far to the end of the podcast, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to the show. You are the ones that make it possible for me to make an income from podcasting, and I greatly appreciate that just by listening to our show. You are helping us gain ad revenue. However, if you would really like to help support the show, I encourage you to please donate to the podcast and become a supporter of the show. You can head over to anchor.fm/Whitfield Report and click the support this podcast button and choose the amount that suits you to support the show. Or you can click the link in the show notes and it will directly take you to that page. If you can support the podcast, I really appreciate that. Anything that you can do to help out is greatly appreciated. Even if you can't afford to help financially support the podcast, I encourage you to please go on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Stitcher and please leave this podcast a positive 5-star review. That really helps us out here at the Whitfield Report. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next episode.